Today, we're going to be looking at the Suez Crisis of 1956. At the center and heart of this conflict, the Suez Crisis, is the newly elected Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. So, with that as our introduction, let's look at the essential questions that you should be able to answer by the end of this video. The first is, what was the situation in Egypt leading up to the Suez Crisis of 1956, so the causes of the crisis? The second is, what happened during the Suez Crisis and Sinai War? And the third is, what was the role of outside powers and their significance in the Suez Crisis? The first thing we're going to be looking at are the three causes of a military coup that takes place in Egypt. So one of the first causes is colonial tension. From 1859 to 1869, the Suez Canal was built. It links the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea and was built by the French and the British. It was finished being built in 1869. It's very, very important for trade in oil. I have highlighted that because it's an important point. So anytime you see something highlighted, you should make note of that. As you can see to the map, it cuts down on the travel. You no longer have to go all the way around Africa to get to Europe from Asia. So it's very important for trade, European trade with Asia, and getting oil from the Middle East to Europe. It was operated by the Suez Canal Company, which was owned by British and French shareholders. An interesting point is that 120,000 Egyptians died while constructing the canal, which is a huge number. In 1882, Egypt becomes a British protectorate. Basically, Britain wants to maintain stability in Egypt because of the canal, because it's so important for their trade. So it takes on Egypt as a protectorate, and many Egyptians dislike the British presence in their country. So if you look at the map, you can see how Africa was divided up between the major powers of Europe. In 1922, Egypt finally gets its independence. However, Britain still has a lot of power and influence in the area, and the Suez Company is still owned by British and French shareholders. In 1936, there is the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, which reconfirms Egyptian independence, but it also gives Britain the right to station troops in the Canal Zone for 20 years. And the Canal Zone would be all of this area leading from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So there is still strong British presence in Egypt, and Egyptian nationalists hate this. Going on to World War II, there are lots of Allied troops in the area, about 250,000 Allied troops, so from Britain, France, US, etc. And after the war, there were still 70,000 British troops in Egypt, and Britain was the single biggest user of the canal. And Egyptian nationalists don't like this at all. So to summarize colonial tension, you can see from 1859 to after World War II, there is a colonial presence in Egypt. And Egyptian nationalists really dislike this. So they're grumbling about it. Another cause of instability in Egypt is after World War II, Egypt is ruled by a king. His name is King Farouk. He represents the wealthy Egyptians, which make up about 6% of the population, and he's known as sort of this luxurious, extravagant plague boy who's out of touch with the real Egyptians. He's also very willing to cooperate with the British. And people, regular everyday Egyptians, are unhappy with him, especially the fellahin. Fellahin is the Arabic word for farmers. So the people who are farming the land and form the majority of the population really think that he isn't a very good king. He's very out of touch. The third cause of instability in Egypt is the rise of nationalism. There is anger towards the monarchy, towards Britain, and towards Israel. And the people who are especially angry are the young army officers. They form a revolutionary movement called the Free Officers Movement. This is only one of many movements, but the one we're going to focus on and is very important. And there are lots of attacks on Britain in Egypt from 1951 to 1952. So as you can see, there's a lot of anger towards colonials in the area of Egypt, and the result is a military coup. So in 1952, July 1952, the Free Officers seized the Egyptian army headquarters, airport, and communication centers in Cairo. It's basically a bloodless coup in which they take over power. The king, King Farouk, is forced to abdicate and live in exile. He first goes to Monaco and then goes to Rome. And the popular and respected General Mohammed Naguib becomes president. Really, he's a figurehead because the man behind the scenes is Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose picture is on the side. This new government in 1953 makes Egypt a republic and bans all other political parties. And in 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser takes over as president, prime minister, leader of the Free Officers, leader of the police, as well as head of the army. So now Nasser, who is a very important man who will come up again and again, takes control. His aims are to eliminate foreign influence, which he does by getting rid of King Farouk, who people thought was too close to Britain, by getting rid of British troops in this canal area. He does this in 1954, and the British troops moved to Cyprus by 1956. He also wants to reform economic and social structure, so he wants to get rid of the big landowners and redistribute the land to the fellahin, who really didn't own land beforehand. And he also wants to modernize Egypt by the creation of the Aswan Dam, which would provide water for food and electricity. The Aswan Dam is very important, and you should make sure you have a note of it in your notes. The Aswan Dam, he gets promises of money from the USA, Britain, and the World Bank to help him build this dam, and this will cause problems in the future. One of the issues faced by Nasser is relationship between Egypt and Israel. As you can remember, the Arab states refused to recognize and trade with Israel. In the Gaza Strip, and that's the area that's very close to the border of Egypt and Israel, it's under Egyptian military control. There are 300,000 Palestinians living in the area, and there are frequent Palestinian attacks from Gaza into Israel. And Israel attacks back. Israel basically is accusing Egypt of supporting the Fedayeen. The Fedayeen is that extreme Palestinian group. In February 28, 1955, the Israeli Defense Force attacks Egyptian military headquarters in Gaza, and Egypt eventually wants revenge, and then it actually does start to train and arm the Fedayeen, the Palestinians, and it starts to strengthen its defenses by buying arms from Czechoslovakia in September of 1955. And it's starting to prepare for war. So Israel wants to try to provoke a war with Egypt before the balance of military power goes in Egypt's favor. There is no war, but the UN and USA are not very happy with Israel for wanting to start a war. So you can see that there's a lot of tension between Egypt and Israel. Another issue is the Cold War influence in the Middle East. NATO is really worried that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the organization that's set up to help Western powers deal with Soviets, NATO is worried that the instability in the Middle East would lead to communist intervention. So they formed this Baghdad Pact in 1955. The goal of the Baghdad Pact is no Soviet infiltration in the Middle East, and it's between Britain, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, and unofficially the US. Nasser doesn't join the Baghdad Pact and takes the stance of non-alignment. Non-alignment is the policy of not taking sides in the Cold War, supporting neither the USA nor the USSR. And basically, this policy of non-alignment makes the West very suspicious of Egypt. They think non-alignment means you're dealing with the communists. So as a result, the U.S. withdraws its funds from the Aswan Dam project. It's trying to send a message to Egypt saying, don't support the communist government. If you do, we will take away money that we promised to you. The problem with this is that when the U.S. withdraws funds for the Aswan Dam project, Nasser reacts very quickly. And the result is, on July 26, 1956, Nasser declares that Egypt is going to nationalize the Suez Canal Company. Egypt will recompense foreign shareholders and will buy them out, and it wants to use the revenue from the canal to finance the dam, finance the construction of the dam. He gives a 90-minute speech in Alexandria to a crowd of 250,000 Egyptians, and you can see that in the image projected. He repeats the name of the French engineer who built the canal, his name is de Lesseps, 13 times. And this was a code for the takeover of offices, communication centers, and headquarters of the Suez Canal Company. So by the end of this 90-minute speech, all of the Suez Canal Company was in the hands of Egypt. This, obviously, makes Britain and France very angry because their economy depends on the oil that is shipped through the canal. So Britain at first wants to take military action, but the USA won't support it. So they tried diplomacy first, and in August of 1956, they hold the Suez Canal Conference in London, England. Their proposal is that they should put the canal under international control, but Nasser rejects this. He says, no way. It's in Egypt. Egyptians will control it. So what do Britain and France do? They remove their staff from the canal in order to pressure Egypt. They're thinking that Egypt can't handle it. They think that Egypt won't be able to move a traffic through the canal without them. However, Egyptian staff maintain the canal really well, and in fact, they increase traffic in the canal. So it doesn't work. Eventually, Britain decides that the diplomacy has failed and it begins to prepare for military action. The USA won't support this military action, but Britain assumes that it's going to be benevolently neutral. So it will just sort of let things happen and not interfere. So the Sèvres Protocol, this happens in October 24th, 1956, throughout October, really. It's this secret meeting between Britain, France, and Israel. They all have gripes with Egypt, and they all want to attack Egypt and humiliate Nasser, but for different reasons. This is secretly happening. What their plan is a joint campaign in which Israel will attack Egypt first and advance into the canal zone quite quickly. And then Britain and France will intervene, asking both the Israeli and Egyptian troops to withdraw, so they seem to be like the peacekeepers. They assume that Nasser would say no, because it is in Egypt, and then Britain and France would step in militarily to protect the canal from Egypt and Israel. And this basically is what they do. So, October 29th, 1956, Israel attacks and the Sinai War begins. As I said, Israel sends troops into the Sinai Peninsula and they advance towards the Suez Canal zone. The next day, so on October 30th, there is Britain asking for a ceasefire ultimatum. Israel is accepting, but Nasser, as predicted, rejects. And Britain and France bomb the port of Said. Basically, that's what's going. The international reaction is that, number one, Arab countries stop oil from getting to Europe. So they destroy their oil pipelines that take oil to the Mediterranean and then on to Europe. That's a big problem for Europe because they need the oil for their economies to continue to go. Another thing is the UN General Assembly calls for an end to the hostilities. And this is passed by a vote of 64 to 5. Only Australia and New Zealand support Britain, France, and Israel. And the USA, who they thought would be benevolently neutral, is actually very critical of British and French actions. And this international reaction was completely unexpected for the British, French, and Israelis. So, in the following weeks, Britain and France announced their ceasefire and withdraw their troops. UN peacekeepers arrive and they stay there for about 10 years, are planning to stay there for about 10 years. And by early 1957, Israel withdraws its troops from the Sinai Peninsula under US pressure. So that is basically the rundown of events for the Suez Crisis and Sinai War. So in the end, the Suez Canal Company was nationalized, so Nasser gets what he wants. And Nasser's prestige was increased, and he's seen as sort of a hero. So these are the things that Britain, France, and Israel did not want to happen. So what is the significance for Israel? Well, first it demonstrates Israel's military superiority in the region. It doesn't get any long-term territorial or political gains. It's still not recognized by Arab governments. And Arab governments see Israel as a sort of the springboard for Western imperialism in the Middle East. So they distrust Israel. The UN peacekeepers' presence in the canal zone allows Israel to utilize a canal through the Straits of Tiran, which is very important for their trade. And basically, the USA is very mad at Israel, but because of the Cold War and because the US doesn't want any more Soviet influence in the Middle East, the USA lends its support for Israel. The significance of this event for Nasser and the Arab world, well, it's a huge triumph for Nasser. His popularity increases immensely. He becomes sort of this hero of the Arab world because he's been able to stand up to the colonial bullies. He has complete control over the Suez Canal and British stores, military stores in the area. The canal is cleared and reopened by April 1957. Egypt also wants revenge for the military defeat, and the Arab states turn against the USA and Israel, and they have, some of them are increasingly looking towards the Soviet Union for support. So that's basically the causes and events of the Suez Crisis and Sinai War.